Hi, welcome to the 59th episode in our series, which follows episode 55 in terms of ideological timeline. But this is British Egypt and Sudan Part 2, following that episode 55. For those of you who are unfamiliar, these are the rules. This is not an academic presentation. I'm not accredited in history, religion, philosophy, or any of the topics that we will be discussing. I'm a lawyer by trade, and I'm going to try and give this presentation from a secular perspective. By that, I mean that I'm going to try and weight both sides equally and sort of tell the story based on the events that there are. That said, this, like all topics in the Middle Eastern History series, is controversial, so let's be respectful. That said, I love interactivity. Questions, comments, clarifications, please put those in the chat. I do read the chat and will respond in real time. I like to say that my presentations are a 101 and a 201, meaning that if you don't know anything, I'll catch you up. And if you already know something, I'll probably add dimensions, sides that you were less familiar with. I also like to say that I will have a 2-hour hard stop. So that's 9 p.m. Eastern time. That will be the last news slide I will cover. If we didn't get to all the information, that's okay. I'll just roll into the next week. And that said, I won't just stop any discussions we're having. I will continue those discussions and we'll have a question and answer session, but you won't miss any new information if you have to leave after those 2 hours. When I put dates below an individual, those are their years of service. And I'm going to record this, like all the other entries, into our Middle Eastern History series, and you can find all of those at our YouTube link. Please subscribe to our YouTube link so you can see all the other 58 episodes that I've been recording since July of 2021. And you can also, if you feel like this content is valuable and that you really enjoy what you're seeing, we really do appreciate donations to our PayPal. Zoom, YouTube, and Meetup are all premium subscriptions, and we pay for those. And while we make this content free because we believe it should be enjoyed by everybody, we do appreciate help along the way. Okay, so last time when we spoke about Egypt, we were talking about the Alawiyya Dynasty. And the Alawiyya Dynasty is the dynasty that descends from Muhammad Ali. And unfortunately, there's a little bit of confusion as to how to call this dynasty because they keep changing the title by which they go. So in the beginning, they have the title of Wali, or governor, because they're part of the Ottoman Empire. They are a province within the Ottoman Empire, and so each province of the Ottoman Empire is ruled by a governor. But Muhammad Ali, even though he has the title of Wali, has significantly more power than other Walis in other parts of the empire. He manages to accord to himself a lot of ability to govern his own territory, his own laws, his own infrastructure projects, his own military. We're going to see some of that, and we have seen some of that in the past. And increasingly, his successors begin to call themselves Khedive, which is a much more lofty title, and it means a viceroy. And this title was finally recognized by the Ottoman Empire in the 1860s. Now, the title of Khedive survives even after the British invade in 1882 and install what's called the Veiled Protectorate. We'll go over all of these again as we move through the history. But during the Veiled Protectorate, the leader of Egypt was still called the Khedive. In 1914, and we're going to discuss this much more in depth because that's sort of where our transition to today's new material comes, the leader then takes on the title of Sultan. The Sultan was a title that was created by the British at the beginning of World War I in order to cut Egypt's cord finally from the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottoman Empire and the British were on opposite sides of the First World War. And so it wouldn't make sense to have Egypt, which was functionally under British control, technically part of an enemy state. So it was made a sultan. And then following Egyptian independence, or we're going to sort of talk about what independence means in this context, because it's not the way we usually would understand the term. The Egyptians declared that their ruler was no longer a sultan, but a king, to rival the king of England. And so they'll take the title Melek. And so we're going to be talking about these Alawiyya rulers with all these different titles, but we should know that it's actually the same dynasty in the same position of power. Those powers might grow or shrink, but in the same position of power despite all of these name changes. All right, so now we talked about Muhammad Ali, who is changing the system in Egypt. He was breaking up the previous organization within the country, which was made of Ottomans, Neo-Mamluks, and Egyptian nobles, and creating a new cadre of officials that surrounded him. He was a modernizer, right? He created large irrigation systems that led to large production of cotton. He worked with the French in order to build a modern navy and modern engineering schools. He completely redid the tax code, built new railroads, started that, sent students to Europe to become more knowledgeable in modern technologies. And of course, he modernized the military by creating a new modern army called the Jaysh Nizami, or the Systemic Army. He did this with help of French military advisors. You can see Joseph Antamsev, who's known in Arabic as Suleiman Basha al-Faransawi, or Prince Suleiman the French one, given his contributions to the development of the Egyptian military and navy. And this was a military and navy that was so powerful that it was able to launch an invasion of Greece when Greece declared independence. And while the Ottoman Empire couldn't stamp out the rebellions in Greece, the attack on the Hijaz, the Ottomans were able to turn to the Egyptians, and the Egyptians were actually able to win these conflicts. So you can already see the strange relationship in power, where what is theoretically a state or province within the Ottoman Empire is actually more powerful from a military perspective than the government of the Ottoman Empire. And this comes to a head in the 1830s and 1840 because of wars that Egypt would fight against the Ottoman government in Constantinople. And in 1833, and also again in 1840, the Egyptians would come close to actually unseating the government in Constantinople and taking over the Ottoman Empire. Now, what's important to notice here is that in both cases, the Ottomans maintained their power not through strength of arms, but through the intervention of Russians in 1833 and the intervention of the British in 1840. As Mark points out, this is actually very similar to the dynamic between the Venetians and the Byzantines. So while it wasn't the case that the Egyptians could expand against the Ottoman Empire successfully, they could expand south, and that wasn't challenged. So you end up with them conquering the Sudan, or this literally meaning the Black people country, right? Sudan. And they're able to defeat a number of disparate tribes. We have to understand that Sudan at this time is not a specific organized country. It is a number of different statelets. And we talked several times ago when we talked about the Mahdi and the Mahdist Revolt, that Sudan was a number of tribes that had been organized by the Funj, the Sultanate of Funj, but these tribes were organized in a very feudalistic way that preserved a significant degree of autonomy. So when that government in Sennar had fallen towards the late 1700s, beginning of the 1800s, through no fault of the Egyptians, like it was an indigenous issue, these tribes effectively became independent in much the same way they had been under the Funj Sultan. And so the Egyptians would conquer tribe after tribe and often use tribes that they had conquered, like the Sharia, against tribes they hadn't conquered, like the people of the Nuba Mountains. And in this way, they were able to conquer the territory and add it to Egypt. Now, as we talked about, during the Egyptian control of Sudan, which is called the Turkish Sudan period, because the Alawiyya Dynasty are ethnically Turk, the Egyptians ruled Sudan as a colony in much the same way that the European powers were ruling their colonies. And you have a large tax burden placed on the local population. The population was enslaved and conscripted. You have plundering of pyramids in order to gain gold and other wealth. You have the exportation of ivory and gum arabic in significant quantities. Sudan, under the Egyptians, was a prize in the sense that colonizers have tended to use that term. It was a place from which resources were to be extracted. The population was to be also removed for its labor capacity, and in return Egypt would be able to maintain its power through the garrisoning of soldiers. In fact, In many cases, slave Sudanese soldiers were part and parcel of the Egyptian colonial apparatus in the Sudan, just as Askari were soldiers of the British and French and Italians in the different colonies they controlled across the Middle East. And as we move into the 1860s, right, the Alawiyya dynasty has one of its leaders, Ismail, who was Khedive from 1863 until 1879. Really tried to modernize Egypt. He was very much an aristocrat, a bureaucrat in the European sense of the term, European sense of both of those terms. He loved opera, which is why he built an opera house in Cairo. He expanded the railroad so that Egypt had the densest railroad network of any country in the world, not just of the developing world. He had massive sugar plantations. He built the entire port of Alexandria. He had thousands of kilometers of telegraph wire constructed, thousands of kilometers of irrigation canals constructed. He really tried to put as much money as he could into building the country into a modern country that could stand up against the European powers. And in many ways, he saw himself as their equal. Now, there's a question here about what is gum arabic. Gum arabic is an emulsifier. So basically what it does is that it prevents things from dissolving out of water. So, for example, if you have soda, right, it has a lot of sugar. If soda was left to be on its own, the sugar would all fall to the bottom, the same way that it does if you have tea or coffee or something where you mix the sugar manually. The reason the sugar doesn't fall out of the soda is because gum arabic prevents that process from occurring. That's the primary use of it. There's a question of, were these financed by sugar plantations and forced labor in Sudan? Actually, no. The sugar plantations certainly buoyed up the Egyptian economy. There's no doubt about that. But a significant portion of Khedive Ismail's wealth in terms of building up Egypt was through loans. And he increased the public debt in Egypt and from about 3 million pounds when he assumed office to 100 million pounds when the British finally called him on it. So a lot of the wealth that he poured into Egypt was not Egypt's to begin with. And one of the things that we're going to see about the Alawiyya dynasty as we progress through today's discussion is how increasingly connected they are to their wealth desires and not as much to necessarily the benefit of Egypt overall. It's much more about image and about prestige than it is about actual financial viability. I also have a question of, who asked France to build the Suez Canal? That was Said Pasha. Said Pasha, I skipped him in this discussion. He was the ruler just before Ismail. We talked about him a lot more in episode 55 and in episode 30, I want to say, when we went over the early days of the Alawiyya dynasty. So that was a coordination between Said Pasha and Ferdinand de Lesseps, who was a French engineer. And Said Pasha was very much a Francophile, so it was a natural relationship that developed, and in 1856, the canal was dug. There's a question of, did the U.S. Civil War increase demand and the value of Egyptian cotton? Absolutely. Again, that fell under Said Pasha. And because of the U.S. Civil War, which was from 1861 until 1865, Egyptian cotton was significantly more competitive. It was less competitive than U.S. cotton from the south, but the U.S. Civil War prevented that export. So Said Pasha was coming out when he died in 1863. He was at a high point in terms of Egypt's economy, and Khedive Ismail managed to push it to the limit. Now, we talked about all of those financial expenditures that Khedive Ismail made, but over half of his expenditures were not on these infrastructure projects. They were in conquest, and he wanted to expand in every direction. His goal was, as we mentioned in responding to those questions, to develop Egypt's prestige. And so in 1875, he launched a conquest of the Darfur. For those of you who are familiar with modern politics, this is the same Darfur that you've heard about with regards to the Janjaweed and the genocide. On the Eastern Front, he attacked Ethiopia, which was defended by their Emperor Johannes IV. And the Ethiopians, despite being less technologically savvy, less advanced than the Egyptian military, they knew the terrain much better. And Ethiopia is known for being particularly mountainous. So between the difficulty of Egyptian supply trains trying to extend over that much desert region, before they get into the Ethiopian highlands, and the difficulty of moving through the mountains. There were many places where only one or two soldiers could pass through the valleys of the mountain ranges. The Ethiopians were able to successfully defend their country. And after he lost the first time against the Ethiopians, he spent even more money to try and prove to his investors that it was a worthwhile investment to try to take down Ethiopia. And the second attack, which was even larger and more financially demanding, also failed. We also have Ismail using foreign leaders in the administration of the empire. So, for example, the governor of the Sudan was a Briton named Charles Gordon, and one of Charles Gordon's subordinates was Rudolf von Schlatten, and Schlatten was a German speaker, I believe from Austria. But in any case, these were not Egyptians who were running a territory that was part of the Egyptian empire. They were outsourcing their colonial apparatus to Europeans who may be more familiar with running it. And as I mentioned before, the debt escalated significantly, and it got to the point where the British decided that they would absorb the Egyptian-owned portion of the Suez Canal in order to recover some of the debt. And in turn, they would also place financial advisors in the government. And so you have Goshen, the British financial advisor, and Joubert, the French financial advisor, who set up a commission. And this leads to Britain having direct control over Ismail's government in the later part of the 1860s. Now, in order to prevent Ismail from further bankrupting the country, in 1879, the British placed into power a successor to Ismail and put Ismail in exile. He goes into exile in Italy. That will be important later. And they put in power Khedive Tawfiq, his nephew, who is much more pliable, and therefore the British feel that they can use it to impose their will. And of course, one of the first things that they do is that they cut down significantly the size of Egypt's military, and they begin to appoint politicians that agree with the British perspective. So while there is an Egyptian Council of Deputies, and these are Egyptians, the ones that manage to sit on the council are those that are pre-screened by the British, especially Lord Cromer, and to a lesser extent by the French financial attaché, Blinière. As a result of this, what is effectively a foreign state, right? Britain at this time is a foreign country, removing the head of the Alawiyya Dynasty and substituting their own monarch, as well as attempts to coerce the officials of the parliament, the new Egyptian parliament, to follow the British regimen. There is a revolt in the officers' corps. And this is actually one of the interesting developments within the period of Alawiyya ascendance across the 19th century. One of the things that the Alawiyya had inherited in the beginning of the century was that most of the military were Mamluk. They were Turks or Circassians, other people who did not speak Arabic. They were not endemic Egyptians. They came from abroad, and they created almost a military caste in society, a military political caste. As we move through with the creation of the Jaysh Nizami, you had a recruitment of a large number of Egyptians. Now, those Egyptians ended up forming the lower and middle tiers of the military. The Mamluk still occupied that top tier. But increasingly, as you move through the 19th century, Egyptians who have seen battle, especially in places like Ethiopia or Darfur, they are increasingly promoted to higher ranks. And Ahmed Urabi is one of these Egyptians who attained the rank of colonel. And so he was seen by many other Egyptians when he revolted of being a representative, not just of the Egyptian military, which had a vaunted place in society given how long Egypt had been under military government of some kind, but he was an Egyptian voice. He was a native Arabic speaker. He was relatively poor growing up, so he didn't have any class advantage. He was seen as very representative. And so when his revolt broke out, he managed to get a lot of the military to side with him against the increasingly British-aligned Khedive Tawfiq. Now, you had supporters who tried to promote the views of Urabi, like the Egyptian population, people from the military who had been thrown out by the British. Remember how the military was cut down by about 60%. And Copts split evenly. Those are the Christian population of Egypt, who are roughly about 10 to 15% of the country. Some of them supported the Urabi Revolt, and some of them did not. In terms of those who opposed the Urabi Revolt, you had European officials. You remember, as we pointed out, Ismail had used a number of European officials in the administration of the Sudan, and increasingly, because of Ismail's debt, the European officials had become more present in Egypt as well. You had those neo-Mamluks, that upper tier of the military, who wanted to preserve the status quo, who wanted to maintain their historical advantages. You had landowners who were often Arab or Turks, but these were a relatively wealthy few. And you had Christians who had come from Syria. A large number of migrants had come from Syria to Egypt to participate in these building and construction projects, as well as the lack of large-scale warfare in those regions because of how difficult the situation had become in the Near East. As we talked about in some of the other episodes, the end of the 19th century saw a lot of conflict between sharecroppers who were of one ethnic group and the landowners of a different ethnic group, like the disturbances in Hauran that we talked about. So one thing, though, that's very interesting and it's worth pointing out is this increasing disconnection between Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, because at this point, Egypt is still theoretically a part of the Ottoman Empire. And so Urabi appealed to Sultan Abdul Hamid II of the Ottoman Empire to intervene and to support the rebellion and bring Egypt back into the Ottoman Empire in a more serious capacity, and to expel the British. But Abdul Hamid didn't know whether he should support Urabi or he should support the British. And so he stayed neutral. He stayed out of the conflict. And this really marks the last time that Egyptians will look to the Ottoman Empire as a government that can actively intervene in their affairs. The divorce between these two sides is now permanent. And following the Urabi Revolt, Urabi is able to take control of the government in 1879, and he expels all the foreigners. You can see Khedive Tawfiq in that completely accurate historical photo, just jumping into boats and running away. And so because of that action, the British decide that they are going to take back the country. And so they use the pretext of several riots in Alexandria against Europeans that had been living in Alexandria. And they launched the conquest of Egypt themselves. And after that war, what they established was called the Veiled Protectorate. Urabi was removed, Khedive Tawfiq was restored to power, and British soldiers managed an occupation of the country. Now, that occupation was led again by Lord Cromer, and he would remain in his position until 1907. So he was the Lord Protector of Egypt for nearly 30 years. And he began to cultivate this idea of the white man's burden. Now, Rudyard Kipling, of course, was the person who wrote the book, but Cromer was a strong believer in this idea, especially the idea that peoples outside of Europe were not as intellectually advanced, not as culturally advanced, not as sophisticated, and that it was the duty of the Europeans, specifically those of white skin, in order to bring them forward unwillingly, unwittingly into modernity so that they could advance as well. And so Cromer set forth not only to organize the military position of the British in India, the British in Egypt, which of course he did. In fact, he disbanded the entire Egyptian army and rebuilt a new one because he didn't want any colonels like Ahmed Urabi coming into existence that could threaten this new British state. But he refused to spend money on the country, except for a few irrigation projects. And he decided that he was going to close schools to deter education because educated people could rebel more effectively, could create speeches and be stirring intellectuals. As a result, the forward movement that had occurred during the Ismail period and the Said Pasha period that preceded it, all the way through the Alawiyya Dynasty, this came to an abrupt halt during this British period in terms of the top-down cultural flowering. We also see that the British make a decision that the rest of Egypt probably couldn't stomach, which was to allow the Mahdist Revolt to be victorious. Lord Cromer ordered Charles Gordon to abandon Khartoum, the capital of the Sudan, and to leave that country to the Mahdists, believing that it would not be within Britain's power to control. The Egyptians, as a point of pride, did not want to give it up. It was for them their first and dominant colony. But the British were going to take more of a direct hand in running Egypt that way too. You also had a number of incidents. The Danshanwai incident is probably the most famous in 1906, but there were a number of these incidents where British summarily executed Egyptians for violating a number of arcane or difficult to understand British rules. And the British military maintained its power and force over the country in a way that Arabs have seen as occupying. That said, the British didn't actually control the government from a nominal perspective, let's say. Tawfiq was still Khedive, he still held that title. The parliament that was convened was still all Egyptians. The police and other civil organizations were still all Egyptians. It just happened that what the British instituted was called the Granville Doctrine, meaning that Egyptians who would be appointed to these positions would have to pass British vetting, for want of a better term, in order to ensure that they were loyal to British interests. And so it was an entirely Egyptian-led government that didn't have any true Egyptian desire manifest within it. There's a question of what was the position of the US government during this time. The US government in the late 19th century and early 20th century had a mostly hands-off policy as concerns the Middle East. There were a few incidents in the middle of the 1800s where the US used gunboat diplomacy with regards to the Ottoman Empire. There were the Barbary Wars in the early 19th century, but that's a very different area than here. Where the US had used gunboat diplomacy against areas in what is today Israel, what is today Lebanon, in order to protect American consulates and American citizens who happen to be living in these countries. But the United States does not take a proactive vision towards the Middle East until after the Second World War. So the Americans really couldn't have cared less about the British Empire. That said, America was often a place of inspiration for peoples in the Middle East because, and we're going to get to it later, Woodrow Wilson's ideas of self-determination were incredibly popular, especially his articulation of that. And the fact that the US hadn't, it sounds ironic to say this today, the United States hadn't engaged in imperialism in the Middle East at this time, America was seen as a neutral third party in the same way that, for example, people might see Sweden today or Switzerland. There's a question of were the irrigation projects to improve domestic food cultivation or to support production of export crops? Both, but mostly the exports. We mentioned the Mahdist Revolt, and since I covered it elsewhere, I'm not really going to cover it here, but it's important to remember that this was an uprising in the Sudan, and it came from the fact that the Sudanese were thoroughly repressed under the Egyptian government, as we pointed out, the Turkish-Sudanese period. And so a number of dervishes spoke out against the Egyptian control. One of them in particular was Muhammad Ahmed, and he led his Samaniya Sufis into a distinct group of dervishes that would lead to a fight against the Egyptian authorities. And those Egyptian authorities, as we point out, are mostly Europeans in terms of the flesh and blood. We saw Charles Gordon, we saw Mehmet Amin that we talked about another time. We saw von Slatten. We have all these different Europeans, and by and large, they get caught up in this revolt that Muhammad Ahmed has, and his revolt in 1884 successfully removes Egyptian presence from Sudan. But the British end up returning in 1896. So they were kicked out for over 10 years. And the way that they were removed was through Herbert Kitchener's creation of a massive railroad that connected most of northern Egypt to the Sudan. And in fact, this railroad was constructed while under gunfire from the Mahdist forces. One of the important things to point out with Mahdism is that it is one of the earliest creations of a religiously compliant state without the use of a caliph. Now, it would be the case that the Mahdi would consider his the successors of the Mahdi would be considered caliphs, but this is separate from the traditional caliph structure that we've seen from the Rashidun to the Umayyad to the Abbasid to the Ottomans. It sits outside of that structure, and in many cases, it can be seen indirectly as a blueprint for some of the modern Islamist groups. There's a question of, did the dervishes see themselves as trying to uphold higher and our spiritual social justice values? Absolutely. That was the argument that the dervishes were primarily making, which is that the social order in Sudan was being terrorized by the Egyptians. There were large parts of the population that were being sold off as slaves. Their economy was being ruined. They had to pay significant taxes. The Sudanese people were suffering, and in fact, that was Muhammad Ahmed's strongest argument in terms of recruiting people, was that he would create a better Sudan for them. He would create a Sudan that's compliant with the Sharia. And this is one of the disconnects I often see between Westerners and Middle Easterners, is that when Middle Easterners talk about Sharia, they're not talking about the extreme punishments for apostasy or for theft. That's certainly part of the Sharia, but that's not what they're thinking about. In their view, they're using Sharia as a term for social justice and equality. And in many ways, these dervishes, by being people who had forsaken so much, they lived very poor lives, very austere lives. They were seen as people who really were going to be just, as opposed to the Khedives who were living a life of luxury, even as they brought the country into debt. So there is very much a sense of social justice incorporated with the religious observance of the dervishes. And in many ways, for those who are more familiar with this, you can see the dervishes in the Sudan very similarly to the Cathars, that through their humility, through their austerity, the Cathars demonstrated to French people that the excesses of the Catholic Church in terms of wealth were things that were not necessary for religious or spiritual enlightenment. But since now the British had created these Sudanese Egyptian soldiers and these corps that would take back the Sudan, the British had a much more direct role in the governance of the Sudan, and it didn't ever return really to Egyptian control. In fact, what the British did is they called it Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, despite the fact that the Egyptians were very marginal now in either its operation or control. And it would remain what was called a joint condominium between Britain and the British-controlled Egyptian government until 1957, when it became independent. Now, we also discussed how there was the Nahda, or the Renaissance. And that Renaissance resulted in many different political ideas occurring in the Islamic world. And in particular, Islamic modernism had been popular in Egypt, but that idea really began to shatter towards the beginning of the 20th century. And you had it go in two ways. And now, for those who don't remember, Islamic modernism is this idea that Islam is a forward-thinking, progressive religion that embraces modernity and science. And the fact that the Western world is progressive and the Islamic world is not is a criticism of the Muslims of the Islamic world, that they are not really reaching back into the truth of what Islam is, which is this science, organization, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. All these ideas are Islamic ideas. The West simply realized them first. And so as Islamic modernism began to be less well received in Egypt at the beginning of the 20th century, it sort of split into two camps. You had secularists like Abdurazik and Taha Hussein, who argued that what Egypt needed to be was a democracy, a secular democracy, and that secularism was the forward progressive impulse of Islam. And in fact, Taha Hussein would argue that Islam would be part of the Egyptian fabric, very similar to the arguments of Namak Kemal, for those of you who remember from the Ottoman context. Abdurazik argued that religion had no place in government. And in fact, if you put religion in government, the fact of being in government would corrupt the religion and make the religion less able to be a moral arbiter of disputes. And so he argued that secularism was key to keeping religion pure, as well as the state capable of doing its modernizing function. On the other side were those who rejected the idea that Islam was a modernizing force, that in their view was that Islam was a hard port in the storm. It doesn't move, it doesn't shake. And so you end up seeing the beginning of what's called the Islamist movement, meaning that you want to create a modern nation state. It's going to have a centralized bureaucracy and system, but that system will be operated according to the Sharia. It will be in accordance with Islamic norms. Not just from a spiritual place, but from a nuts and bolts implementation of Islamic law. And Rashid Reza in Syria was probably the first major advocate of this, but in Egypt it caught on much more effectively in the 1930s and 1940s because of Hassan al-Banna and the Muslim Brotherhood. And we'll talk about them as we move through the time period. But the dominant political thought was not about secularism or Islamism, but Pharaonism, or Egyptian nationalism, the idea that Egypt had its own history and culture, a history and culture that persisted through the generations and connected to each and every Egyptian. Now, it's important to realize that from including that present point in time, and Egypt had not been ruled by an actual Egyptian, with the exception of Ahmed Urabi for about 3 years. Egypt has not been ruled by an actual Egyptian since about 500 BC, when Egypt was conquered by the Persians. It had been ruled by Persians, by Greeks, by Turks, by countless different ethnic groups, but it had not been ruled by actual Egyptians. And so Egyptians were trying to assemble an understanding of what their culture was. And you had numerous discoveries that were going on in this period that were trying to see the reality of what Egypt was. One of the things that we talked about last time in episode 55 was how, in many cases, the pyramids, which of course we know are remnants of the ancient Egyptian civilization, specifically the Old Kingdom period, right? The pyramids were from Khufu and his successors like Khafre. But in a lot of the Muslim period, in order to prevent them from being destroyed, the pyramids were claimed to be built by Muslim architects. And there are still Egyptians today who believe that Muslims built the pyramids, not that the ancient Egyptians did them. So you can see if something as fundamental as the creation of the pyramids was sort of in a mystical time beyond measure, how difficult it would be to convince them of much more fundamental aspects of Egyptian history and nationality. And Pharaonists like Mustafa Kamil did everything that they could to try and promote this view. Probably the most famous Egyptian nationalist, and we're going to talk about him soon, is Saad Zaghloul. And Saad Zaghloul was prime minister of Egypt actually when Howard Carter discovered the tomb of Tutankhamun. And so he had the vision to actually display the Tutankhamun discovery in Egypt, and pressed for an Egyptianization of that history, of creating a link between the pharaohs of the ancient period and their culture and their traditions to the modern Egypt. That didn't mean that people would start speaking ancient Egyptian languages or start wearing obsessive amounts of gold or anything similar, but that there was a meaningful connection between the history of Egypt, the culture of Egypt as it existed then, and the culture as it existed at the present. And by Zaghloul Egyptianifying the remains of Tutankhamun, it really kept the British less able to capitalize on their archaeologists' discoveries of these tombs, and to claim that the Egyptians weren't interested in their past, didn't care about their reality. In particular, you can see this cartoon from the 1920s in an Arabic newspaper, where Tutankhamun is getting up and yelling at Lord Carnarvon, the British financier between Howard Carter's expedition, and basically telling him, like, how dare he come to Egypt? How dare he try to rule over the place of his birth? It should be Egyptians ruling Egypt, and he is waiting until an Egyptian would come, and that, of course, would be Saad Zaghloul. We also see that women are incredibly important in the modernization of Egypt. And you begin to see these things called salons that were modeled after the French salon, but there is a long history in the Arabic-speaking world, especially in Arabia itself, of women coming together to share poetry and books. And they would discuss very weighty ideas, as well as invite important men of the day, to share information and other stories. In fact, Nazle Fazl, who was a princess from the Alawiyya Dynasty, almost all of her salons were primarily men. But that wasn't always the case. You also had May Ilyas Ziada, who was the closest thing you could say to a wife to Khalil Gibran Khalil, who was a Lebanese American poet, and they wrote to each other extensively. She was born in Palestine. He was born in Lebanon. But she came to Egypt, and she hosted a number of salons in her father's name. And she would dress in the guise of various characters from the stories or the poems that she would be reading and talking about. Her parties were attended by very high-ranking officials in the government, both on the British side and on the Egyptian side. She was a very captivating storyteller. There's a question of, were there any organized efforts made to prevent the British plundering of ancient Egyptian tombs and thereby art and valuables, in a certain sense, hijacking Egyptian culture and history? During the early Alawiyya period, right, Muhammad Ali, his direct successors, they didn't see themselves as Egyptians per se. They saw themselves as Turks governing Egypt. And so during that period, there was no effort made to prevent the exportation of Egyptian heirlooms. There was a difference, though, at the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, as Egyptians began to embrace this Pharaonism, this Egyptian nationalism that connected them historically with the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And so there was absolutely a bitter fight between Saad Zaghloul and other Egyptian nationalists on one side, and the British government on the other, over the exportation of the Tutankhamun ruins. And that's why a significant portion of what was found in Tutankhamun's tomb is still in the museum in Cairo. And there has been a push ever since that point to try and reclaim Egyptian artifacts, especially those that were taken without the permission of whatever governing power was in power in Egypt. But again, you have to realize how little the early Alawiyya cared about Egyptian posterity, and so it's something that's missing today. Now, we talked a lot about Egyptian culture last time, but I want to focus today on Hoda Sha'arawi. Hoda Sha'arawi was one of the leading feminists within Egypt. She pioneered one of the first feminist movements in the Arab world, and she did a number of things that were particularly scandalous. As you can see there, she's not wearing a hijab. And in 1920, she famously took off her hijab in the middle of the Egyptian square, and it was very difficult for many Egyptians to handle to see a woman uncovered, but she pushed forward in creating that sentiment. She also aligned with feminists around the world. She went to numerous conferences. She wrote in a number of journals. She tried to discuss feminist issues not only in the Egyptian context, but also in other contexts. She noticed, for example, with the rise of Nazism in Germany, that German women were beginning to lose their hard-won rights, and she wrote about that situation for German women. We also noticed that while she was incredibly sympathetic to the situation of Jews in Europe, she was not sympathetic to them moving to Palestine. In fact, during the later part of the 1930s, she writes quite strongly against Zionism, but her ability to empathize with the plight of people outside of the Egyptian world through the shared nature of oppression and other types of issues allowed her to become the center of Egypt's feminist movement and eventually achieve what was functionally success as women began to increasingly deveil and become part of modern society. So we now get to World War I. And as we pointed out, within the Middle East, there were really 5 fronts in the Ottoman part of the war. And of course, Egypt sits at the edge of the Palestine campaign. And in particular, you can see that there were invasions in and out of Egypt from Israel, Palestine, from Syria, from Saudi Arabia. And so those are what are really important to point out. So with regards to Egypt, as we mentioned, Egypt was in this veiled protectorate period. So it was technically ruled by Egyptians who were part of a province of the Ottoman Empire, but was functionally ruled by the British, which created a weird dichotomy because now Egypt was belonging to the territory of one state, but actually under the control of a state that was at war with the first state. So the British abolished Ottoman sovereignty in name, and they, for those of you who remember, they did the same thing in Kuwait a year earlier in 1913 by making it an autonomous Qaza and then giving Kuwait independence, at least nominal independence under British authority. And so the British did that here, and they renamed the Khedive as the Sultan. In particular, Khedive Abbas Hilmi, who was the Khedive at the time, was actually abroad in Europe when the British decided to do this. And the British didn't particularly like him because he had strong pro-Ottoman sympathies. So what the British ended up doing was removing him while he was away and putting in Hussein Kamil, who was a family member much more amenable to the British, and naming him the Sultan, forcing Abbas Hilmi to live in exile. Now, the Egyptians themselves were not directly involved in the war for the most part, but they were secondarily involved. That is to say, they formed a significant labor corps. They were responsible for building They were responsible for building trenches, creating outposts, putting up communications wire, and many Egyptians did die in World War I as a result of fatigue from what the British were doing. You also see at a much bigger level that the Egyptian economy was suffering. There was inflation, martial law that the British were imposing because the Egyptians were not terribly excited to go up against the Ottomans. They had considered themselves part of the Ottoman Empire. They were certainly more loyal to the Ottomans than they were to the British. And you had large-scale unemployment throughout the country. So in order to respond to this issue, a number of Egyptians came together, led by Sa'ad Zaghlul. You can see him in the center there. There's the man with the white coat, and if you look below him, you can see Sa'ad Zaghlul. These men came together to create what was called the Wafd, or the delegation. And the Wafd represented all sides of the Egyptian nationalist debate that were unified on the idea that Egypt needed to be completely independent and divorced from Britain in order to pursue its own policies. The British response to the Wafd and their desire for self-determination was generally silence. In fact, the British were much more concerned with the advance by Ahmed Jamal Pasha through the Sinai Desert from that red line, which you can see is the Ottoman Egyptian border. And they made their way all the way to the Sinai Canal. In fact, they actually managed to breach the canal, and it was British forces that had to turn them back to that green dotted line at Al Arish by cutting off their supply lines. And when I say the British forces, we should be clear that over half of the forces employed by the British in the Egyptian context were Indians that had been brought from either what's today India or Pakistan and sent as soldiers to fight on behalf of the British interest in Egypt. This was as far as the war actually got into Egyptian territory, though. The British were able to secure the canal and prevent the Ottomans from maintaining control there. Of course, the Germans would have wanted the Ottomans to maintain control there to cut the British off from half of their empire, but that didn't survive. And in fact, as we pointed out, in 1917, after 2 years of attempting to cross the Sinai, push back at Al Arish, General Edmund Allenby was able to conquer Israel-Palestine and push up into Lebanon and Syria. Following the war, there was an attempt by the Wafd to negotiate with the British in terms of developing a new organization for Egypt, independence for Egypt. And the Wafd, of course, was still led by Sa'ad Zaghlul. And so what the British decided to do was to imprison Sa'ad Zaghlul and a number of Wafdists in Malta in order to prevent them from coming to the negotiations at Versailles, to prevent the Egyptians from having a voice in their own future. And so the country erupted in protests. The protest marches in Cairo started, and you could see Egyptians of every religious background. In fact, if you look very closely at the protest sign in the middle of the protest, you'll see a large crescent, and within it you can see a cross and a Jewish star representing all three of Egypt's religious communities of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. You had men in these marches primarily until British soldiers began to open fire on them, and this cost about 800 Egyptian lives, but the protests continued and continued to swell. The British appointed Lord Milner in order to create a sympathetic Egyptian government, trying to do that same technique, the Granville of the Granville Doctrine, to find Egyptians who were amenable to British interests. But he realized that he couldn't just pick any Egyptian off the street. He had to pick people who would have some governing experience, and all of them deferred to Sa'ad Zaghlul, who was still in exile, first in Malta, then in the Seychelles, that they would not negotiate with Lord Milner on their own. They would wait until Sa'ad Zaghlul gave them marching orders. And so Lord Milner ended up speaking with General Allenby, that same General Allenby who conquered Palestine during World War I and had now become High Commissioner in Egypt. Allenby said that he would negotiate with the Wafd and give Egypt some degree of independence. One of the important things that I didn't mention, though, in this entire discussion of the protest was that after those 800 men had been killed, the Egyptians realized that the British were willing to open up fire against men, but perhaps not against women. And so Hoda Sha'arawi, that feminist that we saw earlier, rallied a number of women to come to the protests, and they actually became the front line. They would move towards the barricades, and the British would refuse to shoot on women, which allowed these protesters to move barricade after barricade, area after area, and swarm the entire city, making it impossible for the British to effectively shut down the revolt without granting independence. And in many ways, the struggle for female emancipation in Egypt has gone hand in hand with the struggle for Egyptians to achieve national sovereignty. And it's curious in many ways that the Egyptian women only fully got the right to vote in 1956, which was the same year as the Suez Crisis, because of Egypt's nationalizing control over its own territory. And so, as a result of the pressure from the Wafd, the British, as I said, led by Allenby, sat down and signed a new constitution of independence with the Sultanate of Egypt. And like all independence agreements, it had with the British, it had a significant number of caveats. And for those of you who remember my British Iraq presentation from about 2 weeks ago, it sounds very similar to surrender pendants. So the Egyptians had full independence, but with 4 caveats. The British would maintain all security and communications apparatuses in the empire. Britain would be responsible for defending Egypt against all foreign aggressors. Britain would be responsible for the protection of foreigners who were living in Egypt, as well as minorities in Egypt, and the British would maintain control of Sudan. That last one was a particularly difficult pill to swallow for most Egyptians, considering that the Sudan was their point of prestige. That was their point of empire building, that they had demonstrated that they were a modern and sophisticated people. But of course, they also objected to most of the other clauses, because those would allow Britain to maintain physical power over the country despite not being in charge of day-to-day decisions. And so when Hussein Kamil died in 1917, the new sultan had become Fuad I, and upon the signing of this Declaration of Independence, he changed his title to king, and he declared that he was king of Egypt, but not as the British would have liked the kingdom of Egypt alone. He called his kingdom the Kingdom of Egypt and Sudan, to mark the fact that he rejected this idea that the British would have exclusive control in the Sudan, and that he himself would be the reigning monarch of that territory. Now, King Fuad had a number of different activities that he completed during his 20-year tenure. Probably the most important one in terms of how Egypt exists today is that he founded the Egyptian Royal Archives, which were his personal archives. And into that archives, he managed to draw lots of letters and other historical data about the Egyptian people, as well as coordinate historiography. And in fact, the Egyptian perspective today that treats with reverence some members of the Alawiyya monarchy is specifically because of how Fuad managed to encapsulate that history in the royal archives. And in fact, he's managed to paint that picture that may be slightly more rosy than if Egyptians actually go through their own history. There's a question here as to whether Egyptians were actively involved in the military structure that the British were using to defend Egypt. And that is absolutely the case. The Egyptians were part of the defense of their country, but you have to understand that at any point, if Egyptians were involved in a British military installation, of which there were several in Egypt during this period, or they were fighting alongside British troops in an Egyptian-led company, which also happened during this period, they would be responsible to the British and their orders. So to the extent that Egypt had its own army, which did, and to the degree that Egypt had its own police force, which again it did, these things were circumscribed to a certain degree by the British having the final say in all matters of defense. One of the other things that King Fouad did is that he negotiated with the British, French, and Italians that Egyptian students, a certain number of them, could study in those countries' colleges for free as part of an international exchange with Egypt. And finally, towards the end of his life, he signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of Alliance, which was seen as a way of decreasing British presence in the country, but at the same because it would downgrade the British relationship and allow Egyptians more control over their own security. But in many ways, it seemed to be a watered-down version of what the Wafd had originally been asking for. And so by the Wafd entering into this treaty, it was seen in many ways as an acceptance of Egypt not being a truly independent and sovereign country. You also see during the 1930s and beginning of the 1940s a sense within Egypt that moves away from Egyptian nationalism as a purely local idea, that Egyptians should care about the wider Islamic world, should care about the wider Arab world. And we see this manifest throughout the 30s and 40s in a variety of different forms. The first one is that we see increasing solidarity with the Palestinians. Now, of course, this stamp is from 1967, so that's obviously not in this time period, but the point is that in 1936 to 1939, there was a conflict within the Mandate of Palestine between, I'm going to call them anachronistically the Palestinians, and the Yishuv, or the Zionist settlement within the Mandate, and in particular against the British, who had allowed so many Jews to migrate, especially in the 1920s, to the territory. Now, the Egyptians, of course, firmly supported the Arabs, but the fact that the Arabs were in trouble wasn't immediately concerning. Over the 3 years of the revolt, more and more stories came out. More Egyptians heard more and more about what was going on. And in fact, the British had removed the Arab Higher Committee, which was the Palestinians' representatives, forcing them into exile. And it was the Egyptians who pressed the British to allow the Arab Higher Committee to return and negotiate terms for ongoing relations within the Mandate of Palestine. And in many ways, the Egyptians took credit to a certain extent for the fact that the British then signed the White Paper of 1939, which limited Jewish immigration to the Mandate of Palestine in accordance with the wish of with the Palestinians and with other Arabs like the Egyptians. And this sense, right, that Egyptians are part of the Arab world too. They're not just Egyptians, they're Arabs too. And so we see this change in many Egyptians beginning to see their situation as being part of a wider struggle against the British and the colonialist enterprise. We also see an increasing pull towards Arab identity coming from the weakness that other Arab countries are seeing vis-a-vis Israel and Zionism more generally. And we see this through the creation of the Alexandria Protocol in the middle of World War II. This happened in October of 1944. And the Alexandria Protocol brought together Egypt and a number of other nascent Arab states in order to create the Arab League, which would be a representative body embodying all of the Arab world together. Now, the Arab League is a very interesting institution, and I'm sure we could spend 2 hours talking about how intricately it's created. But it's one of the strange organizations in that all of the members want to be in it for the prestige of being in it and the claim that they're working together as a united Arab world. But at the same time, none of the states involved want to surrender any part of their sovereignty to a larger organization. So this is not anything like the European Union, although clearly the concept was intended to be something like that, but it has no supranational components because none of the leaders could stand to give away any of their power. That said, the reason that this was created, number one, was the threat from a viable Israel, but number two was this rising idea in many states in the Arab world that there was a connection between these different countries that were separated as provinces by the Ottomans, by colonization under different empires, and despite their linguistic and social differences, that they were really part of one larger Arab people. But it's not just it's not just pan-Arabism that begins to circulate more and more in the Egyptian world. We also see pan-Islamism circulating, and then that comes in a variety of different forms. You have things like the visit of Imam Da Pushang. Da Pushang was from the Hui minority in China, meaning that he is a religious Muslim, but of Han Chinese ancestry. And during the Second Sino-Japanese War, which was coincidental with World War II, right? The Japanese invaded China starting in 1931 and would not leave China until 1945. Da Pushang, in addition to seeking help from the nationalists and the communists, who were at that time trying to figure out how to resolve their own civil war to start fighting the Japanese, Da Pushang also came to Saudi Arabia, Egypt, several other countries in the Middle East, because as Muslims, there should be an international solidarity, and perhaps Muslims from the Middle East could do something about the situation in China. This act struck a very powerful chord for many Egyptians who felt that Muslim was another identity of theirs, and the fact that a Muslim was suffering around the world and they couldn't help that person made them feel very shocked and ashamed, really helping to bridge those changes and differences between ethnicities in the creation of a larger Islamic national identity. You also had two other manifestations of Islamism, of Islam being a personal identity, and Islamism as a political tool at the same time. You had the Young Men's Muslim Association, which was founded in Egypt in 1926. This is actually a picture of a chapter in Accra, in modern-day Israel. And these associations were created by Islamists to try and challenge the creation of secular regimes and secular democracies, secular authoritarian states throughout the Islamic world, and to bring about Islamic law as a functional entity. And of course, we've seen Hassan al-Banna before, but we're seeing him here again. In 1935, he founded the Muslim Brotherhood, and in 1937, he was involved in sending some of the Muslim brothers into Palestine to help the revolt there. In his view, the secular nature of Egypt, especially the secular nature of the monarchy, was increasingly alienating Egyptians from their true Muslim identity. And he wanted to help foster that through the creation of young men's organizations like the Young Men's Muslim Association, and create a religiously astute group in the Muslim Brotherhood, or the Ikhwan. There's a question as to why is Egypt an Arab rather than an African country? Did that have most to do with the influence of the Western countries, Islamic countries, or some of both? It had nothing to do with Western countries' influence. But Egypt has always had more trade, more linguistic connectivity, more historical continuity, and more interaction with the Mediterranean basin than it has with sub-Saharan Africa. And there's a number of reasons for that. The first and most obvious one is the Sahara, which is one of the biggest impediments to trade ever constructed, or ever extant. But you also have to realize how the Egyptians perceived the Sudan, right? Their own territory of Black people was one that they ruthlessly plundered, exploited, and sold off. The Egyptians did not see see a historical connection with that South. They saw a historical connection with their East and West, because of the same language, because of the same religion, because of the same airwaves. Especially during this period, you have people coming onto the airwaves. If you remember from our Iraq presentation, King Ghazi in Iraq, who was reigning throughout the 1930s, was pushing a pan-Arab identity on the radio, and that was really popular. Arab radio crossed borders because despite the fact that Arabs speak different dialects, they can all understand to a certain degree each other. And so you have this unity of purpose that starts developing, and in Egypt, it had some of the strongest issues to overcome of that Egyptian nationalism. But we also saw, for example, when we talked about Syria and Lebanon, that Syrian nationalism was also very powerful. And Arab nationalism had to overcome that too. And in Iraq, there was the fight between Iraqi nationalists and Arab nationalists, right? This idea of the local versus the larger scale. And those are conflicts that we're going to talk about a lot more in the 60s and 70s, when that relationship leads to an Arab nationalist temporary victory, and then the 80s and 90s, where Arab nationalism doesn't look as good anymore. So as we move into World War II, Italy is actually the primary threat that the British see in Egypt at first. The Nazis don't seem terribly interested in expanding towards Egypt. They have other more local goals in mind. But as Italy is trying to regain the history of Rome, Egypt seems to be part of that area. And so the British, led by their attaché Miles Lampson, continually asks King Farouk, who Fuad had died in 1936, so his successor, King Farouk, was now in power. So Miles Lampson was continually asking King Farouk to break off relations with the Italians, but he utterly refused. And in fact, his prime minister, Ali Maher, refused to as well. Now, the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936 held that the two countries were allies. And so, accordingly, Egypt should be on the British side against the Italians. However, the Egyptians did not want to break their relations with the Italians and continued to see them periodically. In fact, there's a funny conversation. It's unconfirmed whether it actually happened or not, but I like to think it did. Miles Lampson was having a heated discussion with King Farouk, and he said to him, cut off your relations with the Italians. And Farouk responded, your wife first, meaning Miles Lampson's wife was actually an Italian citizen. And so it sort of showed the hypocrisy to a certain degree of the British requests at this point. Now, the first Italian moves in Africa were, of course, in Ethiopia. And that really started a lot of the negativity towards the Italians from the British side with regards to Egypt and their fears that Egypt might come under Italian attack. And in fact, that did happen. In 1940, the Italians attacked from Libya, which was a colony of theirs, into the northwestern part of Egypt, Sidi Barani, between the 9th and 16th of September. The British were able to repel the attack and push the Italians back to the other side of the border. That said, the fact that the Italians had struck meant to the British that it wouldn't be permissible to sort of allow this sort of game to continue with King Farouk. And on the 4th of February 1942, the British actually attacked Abdin Palace, where Farouk was living, and basically forced him at gunpoint to dismiss Ali Maher as prime minister and choose Mustafa an-Nahas, who was more amenable to removing Italy from the Egyptian court. This overtaking of Abdin Palace and what's called the Abdin Palace incident, and the change of the Egyptian government forcefully at British hands, really lost a lot of credibility for Farouk and the Wafd party that was in power for many Egyptians, because Egyptians were clearly not able to make their own choices about where their country would go, how their country would develop. And accordingly, what it meant to be truly independent, which the Wafd party was supposedly fighting for. Mustafa al-Nahas, for example, was the leader of the Wafd party now that Saad Zaghlul had died. One of the things that's important to point out during this World War II period is that Egypt, even at the very tail end of the war, remained a neutral country. Egyptian soldiers were not supposed to fight allies or Axis, despite Axis sympathies among many Egyptian leaders. Those sympathies came from the fact that the Axis opposed British control of Egypt, which of course they opposed too, and the historic relationship between Egypt and Italy. Remember, Khedive Ismail had gone into exile in Italy. Several other rulers had done that as well, like Abbas Hilmi. And so there was a much more friendly relationship between those two countries. But despite that, Egypt did not declare war for either side. That said, it's estimated that 1,125 Egyptian soldiers died in the war, primarily defending communications lines or other territorial advantages within Egypt, rather than being part of a British contingent or something similar. You can also see in the lower right-hand side, that's Marsa Matruh. Marsa Matruh was where the British defended against the Italian invasion of Sidi Barani. And so that area, which is as far east as the Italians were able to make it, serves as the burial ground for the British who died defending what was nominally Egyptian territory, but part of the British Empire. Later, in 1941 and 1942, the Nazis decided that they were going to support the Italians in their failed attempt at taking Egypt, and instead sent in waves of attacks here. Mark, do you want to talk a little bit about this?
Basically, with the North African campaign, a lot of what drove the success or failure of one, by either the Italians and the Germans on one side or the British on the other, was logistics. The further the Italians got into Egypt, away from their bases in Libya, and then conversely, with the further the British got into Libya and further away from their bases in Egypt, the more difficult it was to supply their soldiers with water, with gasoline, and ammunition, and that would weaken them and then give an opportunity for the other side to attack and then continue. So when the Italians initially invaded, that was a move on Mussolini's part, and one of many failed moves. He attacked Egypt, that failed. He attacked Greece, and that failed. The British were able to initially, or rather quickly, rebuff the Italian attack in latter part of 1940, and they were on their way to win and conquer Libya and have the whole thing over in 1940, or early 41. But another thing that happened in Europe is that the Germans, Hitler had been forcing, strong-arming the Yugoslavians to come into an alliance with the Germans, which they eventually did. And then a few days later, a week later, they broke that treaty. So Hitler decided to invade Yugoslavia and then Greece. And as the British were in Libya, about to defeat the Italians, Churchill says, "No, I'm going to take all these troops that you need for victory in Libya right now, and we're going to throw them in Greece, where they were basically wasted on the Greek mainland and later on in Crete." And it was that allowed the Italians and later the Germans to throw out the British from Libya, and then push further into Egypt. And by this time, we're in 1942, and later 42, the Germans were on their way to, it was open question whether the Germans were going to be able to conquer Cairo, Alexandria, cross the Nile and the Suez Canal, and then the idea was to go up, connect with what do you call it, Vichy-run Syria, take over Iraq, and then kind of a pincer movement against the Soviet Union because they had no defenses there. Fortunately for the Allies, they were able to hold off the Germans in that last attack. And by the way, just as to say, to give a scale of it, the German contribution, the Africa Corps, was at no point more than 3 divisions compared to the 153 divisions they had on the Eastern Front. So it gives you a sense of scale of where the German effort was. And eventually, there was a battle of Bir Hakeim in the south of the German effort. They were trying to go around the British to the south, and eventually the Germans German attack ground down, and that was the first battle of El Alamein. Montgomery, who was on the right in the Bray, he was out of World War I. He was a very cautious commander. He was very cognizant that the British had very limited manpower and could not waste men like they had in Passchendaele and Ypres during the First World War. And so he husbanded his resources for some months, collected a lot of equipment, kit, particularly tanks, Grant's lead tanks from the Americans, and then attacked. Once he had overwhelming odds, then he attacked in the second battle of El Alamein, which I remember, Richard, El Alamein is Arabic for the place of 2 flags or 3 flags?
Yeah, the 2 flags.
2 flags, okay, presumably the Germans and the British.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that second battle of El Alamein was a decisive victory for the British, and this was in late 1942. The Americans had, at very, very close to that time in November of 42, landed in Morocco and Algeria, basically forcing the Germans and the Italians into a pincer movement, which then moved on later. The battle moved on to Libya and then later on to Tunisia in early 43. So anything else?
No, that's fantastic. Thank you, Mark. I really appreciate that. We have a comment here, and I think it's very apropos. The Italians bombarded Tel Aviv and Haifa. They also hit Alexandria. In fact, one of the major issues that a lot of Egyptians at the time had with King Farouk is that King Farouk refused to turn off the lights in his palaces as the Egyptians were bombarding the city of Alexandria at night. So you can imagine that the Alexandrians were less than excited to see that the Italians could hit the city dead on every time they fired because the king left his lights on. Now, there's a question here as to whether Rommel and Montgomery were ever pictured together, like the picture down there. That picture is a Photoshop creation. The two men were never in one frame together. I'm sure there were points at which they were communicating, but I don't think they were ever in the same place, maybe over phones or something else. There's another question of, were the Egyptians equally adverse to the Germans and the British?
I'm sorry, so some of the Egyptian military officers like Nasser at the time, and I think Sadat as well, were quite in favor of the Germans. Basically, they were hoping that the Germans would come in and liberate Egypt from the British, probably not unlike how the Ukrainians hoped that the Germans were going to liberate them from the Bolshevik Russians, and it didn't turn out too well.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right interpretation. There were certainly more neutral members of the Egyptian military than Nasser and Sadat, but there was nobody in the Egyptian military who was gung-ho pro-British. It just wasn't where people were. But there were definitely people who thought the Axis might help Egypt attain independence, which of course was not really a Nazi war aim. All right. So once we move into the post-war environment, we have a very sort of interesting situation here in Egypt. The first thing is that because of the need for cotton in the construction of uniforms, in a lot of military hardware, all these kinds of things, Egypt was actually a net creditor after World War II. And Britain was actually taking out loans from Egypt, which really harshened the relationship between Egypt and Britain, because Britain had to force Egypt to buy its own British exports in order to try and recoup money and try and offset the deficit. But the Egyptians, by and large, were too poor because the wealth was concentrated among the wealthy landowners to actually purchase these things. So it ended up with a large amount of antagonism between the British and the Egyptians, despite the fact that the Egyptians were effectively riding high at the moment. And in fact, Egypt, as an independent country, at least nominally, was able to sign the UN Charter. Despite this, because of the animosity that was developing because of these economic circumstances, as well as the difficulty the British were having with maintaining their own budget internally, the Egyptians took steps to, let's just say, not bother with treating British concerns particularly positively. And one particular example of this was that when Italy was declared a republic in 1946, the King of Italy, Vittorio Emanuele, was looking for somewhere to go into exile, and the Egyptians took him in. Remember, of course, we've talked about the historic Italian-Egyptian relationship. But when Vittorio Emanuele III came to Egypt, the British were deeply displeased by that, considering that Vittorio Emanuele had been supportive of the fascist leader Benito Mussolini during World War II. Another person that Egypt took in was Amin al-Husseini, who was one of the leaders of the Palestinian Civil War in 1936 to 1939, and had been an ally of Hitler's from 1941 onwards. But again, King Farouk was sort of stretching his muscles and trying to see how effectively he could make Egypt more independent from the British than it had already been. You also have the Jewish situation going on across the border in the Mandate of Palestine. The Egyptians were deeply resentful towards the creation of a Jewish entity in that area, and antagonism towards the Jews was on the rise. In 1947, 1948, and in 1950, there were attacks on the Jewish quarter in Cairo. Several people were killed, significant amounts of property were looted or plundered, and this affected both the rabbinical Jewish communities and the Karaite Jewish communities that had come to live in Cairo. In many cases, the anti-Semitism came part and parcel with the anti-Zionism. Because of the British increasingly being unable to financial support and the increasing resistance from the Egyptian government, the British left Cairo and a number of other postings throughout Egypt and concentrated their military along the Suez Canal zone. Finally, one of the curiosities of the Egyptian economy, we've talked about how Egypt was incredibly wealthy because of the production of cotton. That wealth, as I said, really circulated among the highest and most wealthy individuals within the Egyptian economy. Significant landowners, individuals like that. The majority of the population was not well off. Drinking water in Egypt was very polluted, and schistosoma and cholera affected together about 80% of the Egyptian population. These are easily treatable diseases, waterborne infections. But because of the lack of universal health care of even a most basic degree, many Egyptians were suffering under these conditions. There's a point here that one of our participants, her father, who sold art books to King Farouk in Alexandria and Cairo, lost his stores in 1948. That's exactly the kind of thing that was happening during these attacks on the Cairo Jewish quarter. And as we move into the Arab-Israeli war, Egypt is firmly on the side of leading the Arab League, right? We talked about the Alexandria Protocol of 1944, which set up the Arab League to form in complete fruition in 1945. And Egypt was really the heart and soul of that organization. And that organization's primary interest was the removal of any Jewish state in the historic Mandate of Palestine. So what we end up seeing is that the Arabs object, and Egypt invades as soon as the Israelis declare independence on the 15th of May of 1948, and they invade from the south. So if we're looking at this southern front, the Egyptians have the largest military that is involved against Israel. Remember, the Jordanians are the best trained because they still have British commanders, as opposed to the Egyptians, who have tried to segregate their military from the British. And the British, of course, have really left most of Egypt except for the area around the canal. The Egyptians made a number of key advances against the Israeli forces, and probably their best advance, if you look at that map from October of 1948, was forcing the Israeli forces to be separated between those in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem in the north and those around Beersheba in the south. But the Israelis were able to push out in most directions. The only area in which the Egyptians offered significant resistance was in the Gaza area, where they were able to hold their position. By February of 1949, Israeli forces were already crossing into sovereign Egyptian territory, into the Sinai Desert. And the Egyptians were willing to call an armistice as their military had been shown up quite poorly, quite badly throughout the conflict. Enter Ralph Bunche from the United Nations, and he coordinated the peace negotiations between the Egyptians and the Israelis. As I mentioned during the Zionism history episode, the Egyptians refused to speak to the Israelis and would only speak to Bunche throughout the entirety of the negotiations. Now, there's a question of, was it difficult for Egyptians to overcome their distaste for atheism to draw closer to the Soviets, including relying on them for support for the Aswan High Dam, as well as later arms deals? The atheism support of the Soviet Union wasn't as important in the minds of left-wing minded Egyptians, but that is an Egyptian set of politics that will happen during the Gamal Abdel Nasser years. So the politics are very different from what's going on in this period. During this period, Egypt has no large-scale international benefactor. And if there were to be one, it would probably, if they had to choose a side of the Cold War, like at that moment, it would have been the United States. It wouldn't have been the Soviet Union. There's a question here. Was the last time Egypt was in a war the second act of Aida? I'm trying to think. Well, Egypt won their war against the Sudan. They won their war against Darfur. They won several of those wars that we spoke about today. But if we're talking about a large-scale international conflict, right, as opposed to colonial conquest, then we have to go back to the wars that they fought against the Ottomans, that they only lost due to international pressure, not through strength, not because of strength of arms. So I think if we're talking about post-Israel creation Egypt, yes, Egypt has not won a war against Israel. So we then have the election of 1950 after the armistice that ends the Egyptian participation in the Arab-Israeli War of 1948 to 1949. And what we end up seeing here is that the Wafd party does tremendously well. You can see that before the election, they'd had a very small number of seats, and after the election, they had taken all of that brown area. All those seats had belonged to other parties, and the Wafd just took them all. And so Mustafa al-Nahas, that leader that had taken part in the pro-British activities during the Aberdeen Palace incident in 1942, he becomes the prime minister yet again, and he's the prime minister for Farouk. And we've talked about Farouk, but I want to really stress how disconnected he was from the average Egyptian population. He was incredibly wealthy. He had numerous palaces across the country, while, as we pointed out, significant percentages of Egyptians were suffering from easily preventable diseases. You had a massive divide between the wealthy and the poor, and he was an incredibly repressive towards freedom of speech that would portray him in any negative light. And there was a lot of negative light to be thrown in his direction. It wasn't just the fact that he left the lights on in Alexandria. He was a rapacious philanderer. Several of his ministers were involved in going to the nightclubs and bars throughout Cairo and Alexandria and finding him women to have relations with. And across magazines in the Western in the West, there were pictures of Farouk with all these women that he was sleeping with. In Egypt, of course, these were banned, but that didn't stop the Egyptian people from becoming aware of the situation. He was also prone to having lavish occasions with other wealthy individuals from outside of Egypt. And so you begin to see this disconnect from the population towards Farouk. And this emboldens a number of leaders of the military who see a very strong parallel between this situation and the situation of Khedive Ismail, where he was overspending and not really necessarily in the benefit of Egypt. So what ends up happening is that we have a powder keg. Mustafa al-Nahas and the Egyptian government order the British troops to abandon the Suez in 1951. And they do so because, as the leaders of the Wafd of that delegation trying to push for independence, they want the last vestiges of British control of Egypt gone. And the British decide to resist, and in the canal zone, they end up going to the city of Ismailia, which is the largest Egyptian city close to the canal. And they get into a conflict with the police station, the Egyptian police station in the city. The British order the police to stand down. The police order the British to stand down. The British slaughter the police. This does not go very well. And you end up seeing a lot of clashes throughout the canal zone between British forces, British military, and Egyptian police forces in the region. And this leads to the Great Cairo Fire on the 26th of January, 1952. It's unclear who started the fire, and there have been many suspicions about the initial starters, be they Egyptian revolutionaries, be they British soldiers, be it the monarchy, be it communist sympathizers, but regardless, the fires start to break out across Cairo, and it takes a significant act on King Farouk's part to bring order back to Egypt. This Suez crisis ends up resulting in the British maintaining control of the canal, and Farouk barely being able to put out the fires in Cairo. It's estimated that between all of the chaos, a few hundred people died in this crisis. And the fact that the government's response was so slow and so incapable, the British were about to actually land more troops in Egypt to keep the peace. It led the military officers who were of the view that Farouk was too far removed from the concerns of the Egyptian people to effectively govern. It moved them into a position where they wanted to strike more quickly than less. And so in July of 1952, several of the officers led by Mohammed Naguib, you can see him in the car on the left-hand side, and his attaché, Gamal Abdel Nasser, you can see him on the right-hand side of the car, launch a coup against the government, and they force Farouk into exile. They then appoint his young son, Fuad II, to be the monarch, and in just 1 year, they'll expel him too, thoroughly ending the monarchy and changing the Kingdom of Egypt into the Republic of Egypt. And we're going to cover the Republic of Egypt and the developments from that in a future discussion. But this sort of parallels in many ways what we saw in Iraq, where you had the kingdom that was installed and protected by the British. In that case, it was actually installed by the British as opposed to just being supported. And then monarchy cultivated a strongly negative view among the people for how alienated it was from the common sentiment and its closeness whether real or perceived, to the Western powers. So, questions, comments, concerns? And while we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, let me tell you a little bit more about our group. We are History Mostly Ancient Discussions. You've been part of the Middle Eastern Islamic History series that I host every Thursday. And we have 2 more sessions coming up for this year, one on the 8th, one on the 15th. On the 8th, we're going to talk about the Maghreb, which is North Africa, Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, and Libya. And we're going to talk about them from 1880 until 1930 or 1940, depends how far we get. And that part will also pick up from where we left off in episode 33, when we talked about the Maghreb in the period of the 19th century. We have our Asian philosophy group, which is going to meet on Saturdays. They are going to talk about some Hindu philosophy. European Union, we're having a meeting on the 11th of December. That's not this Sunday, but Sunday following. And Aaron is going to lead that discussion, primarily on the war in Georgia in 2008 and how Europe responded to that. In our Powerful Women series by Jane Prendergast, we're having a meeting this upcoming Sunday, the 4th of December, on Eleanor of Aquitaine. In our Dead Languages series, we are going to talk about the Gaze language, and that's, I believe, in 2 Saturdays. That's the 10th of December, which is the historic and traditional religious language of Ethiopia. And in our short run series, we're probably going to go back to the Russo-Ukrainian War to give an update this January. And some of the upcoming hits and favorites that you might get in the Middle Eastern history series when we return in 2023. Where we talk about, for example, the different political philosophies in the Arab world, like Arab liberalism, Islamism. We talk about the development of modern Israel and the Palestinian situation. We talk about the Arab Republic of Egypt, independent Syria and Lebanon, including the Civil War, Iran's transition from post-World War II to the revolution to the present, Kurdistan and the current situation with the Kurds, modern Iraq, including the US invasion, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan in the post-Soviet period, all of the different Afghan states in the 20th century. So there are a lot of really interesting things that we plan to cover in 2023. And so that brings me back to the question page. So we have a point here that Egypt did severely shock Israel by succeeding in crossing the canal in 1973 in a surprise attack and using hydraulic hoses to dig routes through the banks on the Israeli side. Israeli moves to throw its own troops across the canal largely led to a draw in which Kissinger's shuttle diplomacy ended the fighting. I agree. And it's difficult to say, though, that Egypt actually won the conflict, since the conflict was ended as the Israelis were advancing on Cairo and the Egyptian Eighth Army was entirely encircled by Israeli forces. That said, in Egypt, it's definitely cast as a win, and that's why Sadat was able to use leverage from that quasi-victory in order to get the peace treaty. That said, he still died for peace with Israel. So there's a question of, on the topic of Kissinger, did he influence Egyptian or Middle Eastern politics? It's horrifying what he did to Bangladesh and Vietnam. I'm not aware of Kissinger influencing Middle Eastern politics the way he did in Bangladesh or Vietnam. Primarily because the Arab world was less responsive to the West. They were willing to entertain the Soviets. And so there was this balance of powers, and the Soviets actually did send soldiers to Egypt. So it was much harder for Kissinger to control their policies in the same way that he could leverage the US presence in Pakistan or the US presence in Vietnam to cause damage to those countries. There's a question of what was Eisenhower's incentive to get the British out of the Suez? Mark, do you have any comments on this?
Just remember that the American Sixth Fleet was used to pressure the British and the French to remove their troops from Egypt. The Americans were quite upset. I don't think they knew that the British and the French were going to invade Egypt, and they were rather miffed.
Yeah, I think yeah, that's definitely part of it. The other part that I remembered was that Eisenhower was very much against the creation of a large-scale return to the imperialism of the pre-World War II era. And so I think he wanted to preserve Egyptian independence more than he was willing to support the British. And because he did that, it created a massive shift in the international policies of the West, where Britain and France were now recognized as fallen powers, and the United States was ascendant, especially as concerns the Middle East. There's a question of what was the role, if any, of the Copts in Egyptian nationalism and Pan-Arabism? Well, Egyptian nationalism, Copts featured actually quite strongly in that. You have a number of Copts, their names escape me at the moment, but they have a number of Copts who write extensively on the continuity of Egyptian history, and they point to the fact that, for example, when the Rosetta Stone was translated, a lot of what those French and British linguists used in order to translate the Rosetta Stone was Coptic liturgy, because Coptic liturgy preserved certain forms of Demotic, which was one of the three languages on the stone. And so, for many Copts, Egyptian nationalism is the natural direction that they would go, rather than a Coptic nationalism. And the primary reason for both of these is A, Copts never felt severe discrimination in Egypt. Egypt was a difficult place to live for centuries. And we've covered that in the series about how repressive Mamluks and Neo-Mamluks were, but they were repressive to everybody. It wasn't just Christians. And so they were a full part of Egyptian society. And the second part is that there's no part of Egypt where Copts form a majority. So just from a functional perspective, it never made sense. So Coptic Egyptians feel very Egyptian. And in fact, Copt comes from Klept, which is the old form of the term for Egypt, Egipet, right? Kipt. And so that's their country in that sense. Arab nationalism was something that divided the Coptic population. There are certainly Copts that have gone along with it, but in many cases, the Arabization project, as Gamal Abdel Nasser implemented it, and of course we'll discuss that when we discuss the Arab Republic of Egypt, was in many cases designed to make Copts identify as Arabs, and in many cases Copts refuse that identification. They see themselves as part of Egyptian society. They don't see themselves as part of the Arab world, despite the fact that they speak Arabic. And this, for many Pan-Arabists, was a source of consternation, especially Sati al-Khusri, who said anybody who speaks Arabic is an Arab, regardless of what he thinks, regardless of what he believes, he is an Arab. And a lot of Copts felt that no, their Coptic identity was an ethnic identity as well as a religious one, and that they are Egyptian nationals. They're part of the Egyptian national project, but they're not part of the Arab national project. That said, I'm not familiar with any Coptic opinions that diverge from the Arab opinions with regards to major foreign policy questions, like Israel, like the Gulf states, like Iran, like Turkey, like Europe. I don't see the Copts having a divergent opinion on those topics. Whereas, for example, if you look at the Assyrians in Iraq, you do have divergent opinions between the Christian Assyrians and the Muslim Arabs. In Lebanon, you see the same. Divergent political opinions between the Christians, like the Maronites or the Melkites or the Greek Orthodox, and even within those you see divergent political opinions versus the Sunni and Shiite Arabs. So it's a very different question when it comes to Copts and Pan-Arabism, but it's a really great question. There's a question of, did the Italians, Germans, or French influence Egyptian cuisine? Absolutely. Absolutely. Probably the easiest way to see this is in koshari. Koshari is an Egyptian delicacy, delicacy is the wrong word. It's Egyptian street food, and it's made by adding lentils, pasta, tomato sauce. In fact, Egyptians will tell you it's got ingredients from basically every place that Egypt has ever traded with. But it is quintessentially Egyptian in that it uses Egyptian spices, and it really sits well on an Egyptian palate. There is a strong amount of French cuisine. I don't know how much German stuff has influenced Egyptian cuisine, just because of the physical distance between the countries, and the foods that grow in Germany wouldn't grow well in Egypt. But Italian food, definitely, British to a certain degree, French to a greater degree. But you also have influence from other local Mediterraneans. There's a lot of Greek influence, especially when it comes to how Egyptians prepare fish. Fish is actually really common, especially in Alexandria. So there's absolutely foreign influences in Egyptian food. There's a question here, is that did the previous programs help with making this program tight? Absolutely. This one of the neat things about the 20th century is that, as opposed to the previous centuries, is that all the different countries in the Arab world are moving at their own pace independently to a much greater degree than we had during the unified Ottoman Empire period, or even before that, where you had these large empires that controlled what are today 4 or 5 different Middle Eastern states. And where there's more independence, I have a lot more time to talk about all those different things going on. But at the same time, the fact that we've been through the 1910s, 20s, 30s, 40s, at least 5 times now, there's no surprise anymore about all these things coming around the bend, and I don't have to keep discussing them. And that's also the joy of having this as a series, so you can just follow it through. And these ideas you can sort of pull, like, oh yeah, we talked about that in episode 45, and I see how that connects to that thing in episode 52, and that sort of follows through to this thing that I've just heard today in episode 59. And you see the way that parts of the Middle East are talking to each other in real time and having real developments. One of the examples, for example, we keep talking about Iraq in this situation. Well, Iraq had the revolt that occurred in Iraq, the 14th of July Revolution in 1958, was modeled on the Free Officers Revolution of 1952 in Egypt, right? They're listening to each other, they're playing off of each other, and sort of moving together, but at their own paces. And so that's creating this disjointed set of wars and different partners. And we're going to talk about, either when we get to the Republic of Iraq or the Arab Republic of Egypt, that Nasser is going to be very angry that the 14th of July revolution in Iraq doesn't lead to a Nasserist regime. It leads to a Iraqi nationalist regime. And thank you, everybody, for your kind comments. We will see each other next week. And yeah, pleasure to see everybody. All right, goodbye.